Welcome to ABTop. Under the dim light of the living room, I walked into the house and immediately realized something was wrong. Everything seemed to freeze at that moment. That strange man had no idea he had walked into the worst house of his life. This isn't just a story of betrayal but a journey to put the one who broke my family behind bars. You won't believe what happens next. Let's get started, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new updates. James stood near the bar at his company's annual work party, nursing a drink that tasted more bitter with every sip. The bright lights and loud laughter of his coworkers only amplified the emptiness he felt inside. His eyes, however, were not on the festivities but on his wife, Sarah, who stood across the room, laughing a little too brightly at something his boss, Martin, was saying. There was something off in her demeanor lately, an emotional distance that had crept into their marriage like a silent thief. For months now, James had felt this growing chasm between them. It started subtly. Sarah began keeping her phone face down during dinner, excusing herself from the table more frequently to take calls or answer texts. Her late nights at work became more common, and when she did come home, she offered only half-hearted explanations about long meetings or important deadlines. James tried to push the suspicions away, but the knot in his stomach wouldn't let him ignore the signs any longer. Tonight, at this party, surrounded by colleagues, the weight of his suspicions felt unbearable. His eyes kept returning to Sarah, her body language just a little too close to Martin's, her laugh just a little too flirtatious. The clues were piling up, each one pointing to the same inevitable conclusion: Sarah was having an affair. As he watched her, James's mind wandered back to the beginning of their marriage. They had been happy once, or at least that's how he remembered it. They'd built a life together, filled with shared dreams and quiet moments of comfort. But somewhere along the line, those moments became fewer, replaced by Sarah's growing distance and his gnawing insecurities. And now, standing in this room, the man James suspected of being at the heart of their troubles was his own boss, Martin. Martin was everything James despised in a person: arrogant, self-serving, and always looking down on those around him. The mere thought of Sarah being with him was like swallowing shards of glass. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung, it was who she had chosen to betray him with. James felt his pulse quicken, his grip tightening around his glass. The thought of confronting Sarah, of asking her outright if she was sleeping with Martin, flashed through his mind, but something stopped him. He wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. Instead, he forced himself to engage in small talk with a few coworkers, keeping one eye on Sarah the entire time. She moved through the room with ease, her beauty undeniable, but to James, she felt like a stranger now. Every smile she flashed at Martin felt like a knife twisting deeper into his gut. As the night wore on, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would confirm all his worst fears. His stomach churned as he saw Martin make his way toward him, a smug grin plastered on his face. James braced himself for the inevitable. "James," Martin greeted, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Enjoying the party?" James forced a smile, his voice betraying none of the tension boiling inside him. "As much as one can, I suppose." Martin's grin widened, his eyes flickering briefly to where Sarah stood, now talking to another colleague. "You know," Martin began, his tone casual but with an underlying edge, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." James felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. "Oh? What about?" Martin leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for only James to hear. "Sarah and we've been seeing each other for a while now." The words hit James like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He froze, unable to process what he had just heard. He stared at Martin, waiting for some sign that this was a cruel joke, but there was none. Martin's smirk only deepened. "And," Martin continued, "we're planning a little vacation together soon. She seems really excited about it." James's blood ran cold. His mind was spinning, his thoughts racing. He turned his gaze to Sarah, who, as if sensing his eyes on her, glanced his way. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that moment, James knew it was all true. The affair, the lies, the distance, it had all been leading to this. Martin's voice snapped him back to the present. Don't take it too hard, James. These things happen. People grow apart. James swallowed the bile rising in his throat, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. But instead of exploding, instead of making a scene, he did something he hadn't expected. He smiled. Good to know, Martin, James said, his voice eerily calm. Good to know. Without another word, James turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Martin standing there, looking momentarily surprised by his reaction. James's mind was no longer clouded with confusion or sadness. It was clear, razor-sharp with a single purpose, revenge. He would not allow Martin or Sarah to get away with this betrayal. Not without paying for it. And thus, the seeds of his plan were planted. James left the conversation with Martin feeling a mix of shock, anger, and a sense of cold detachment. The words still echoed in his mind. Martin and Sarah had been seeing each other for a while now, and they were planning a vacation together. His wife, the woman he had trusted, was betraying him with the man he despised most. James moved toward the balcony of the venue, needing a moment away from the noise and the people. The cold night air hit his face as he stepped outside, grounding him in the harsh reality of what he had just learned. He leaned against the railing, his mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like he was sinking into a deep, dark pit. How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied to him? All those late nights, the secretive behavior, it all made sense now. The clues had been there, and yet he had ignored them, hoping it was just his paranoia. But now, there was no escaping the truth. The woman he loved, the woman he had built a life with, was unfaithful, and she didn't even care enough to hide it properly. James glanced back into the party through the glass doors. He could see Sarah, still mingling with the crowd, laughing and smiling as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed for James. The marriage they had once shared was over in his mind, reduced to nothing but a cruel facade. She had chosen Martin, a man James couldn't stand, a man who took pleasure in flaunting his power and wealth. It was a bitter pill to swallow. As James stared at Sarah, something inside him shifted. The pain was still there, but it was morphing into something darker, something colder. His sadness turned into a burning need for retribution. He wouldn't let this slide. He wouldn't be the fool who stood by while his wife and his boss made a mockery of his life. He knew he had to act, and he had to act decisively. At that moment, the glass doors behind him slid open, and James turned to see Sarah walking toward him. She had a look of mild concern on her face, but it was so faint that James could see through it. It was as if she knew something was off, but she didn't care enough to truly engage with it. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice sounding far too casual for the gravity of what had just happened. James stared at her for a long moment, his mind working through everything he wanted to say. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to throw all of her lies back in her face. But instead, he did what he had always done, he kept his emotions under control. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice cold and distant. "Just needed some air." Sarah nodded, seemingly satisfied with his response, and turned her attention back to the party inside. It was as if she had already moved past whatever tension was brewing between them, unconcerned with the weight of her betrayal. And that was what hurt James the most, her indifference. As she started to walk back inside, James called out to her, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing within him. "Sarah." She stopped and turned back to face him, raising an eyebrow in question. "Are you seeing Martin?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the truth they both knew. For a brief moment, Sarah looked caught off guard. But then, to James's shock, she shrugged, her expression almost apathetic. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." James felt the world tilt beneath him. Even though he had already suspected it, hearing her admit it so bluntly was like a punch to the gut. But instead of breaking down, instead of letting his emotions take over, James felt a strange calm settle over him. He had his answer now. There was no more doubt, no more room for excuses. She had made her choice. "Martin told me you're planning a vacation together," James said, his voice devoid of emotion. Sarah crossed her arms, as if daring him to react. "We are." Her words confirmed everything, and in that moment, James knew what he had to do. He couldn't salvage this. There was nothing left to fight for. But what he could do was make sure that neither Martin nor Sarah came out of this unscathed. "All right," James said quietly, turning away from her. He didn't need to say anything else. The decision had already been made in his mind. As Sarah walked back inside, leaving James alone on the balcony, he stood there in the cold, staring out at the city lights. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was no longer chaotic. It was focused now, a tool he would use to get his revenge. James took a deep breath, his thoughts clear for the first time all night. He wouldn't confront them tonight. That would be too easy, too simple. No, he would plan this carefully. He would bide his time and make sure that when he struck, it would be devastating. And as the night continued around him, James began to plot his next move. James left the party with his mind racing, his emotions tightly controlled, but underneath the surface, a storm brewed. The revelation of Sarah's affair had cut deep, but instead of breaking down, something inside him had solidified. He had always been a man who approached problems with logic and precision, and now, even in the face of this personal betrayal, he would treat it no differently. He wasn't going to confront her in a fit of rage or let Martin get the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. No, he was going to make them pay in a way they'd never see coming. As James drove home, his plan began to take shape. He knew he needed evidence, solid, undeniable proof of the affair. Not just for his own satisfaction, but for what came next, a divorce that would leave Sarah with nothing. He had heard too many stories of men blindsided by divorce proceedings, losing everything to wives who had cheated, who had lied. That wouldn't be him. James would make sure of it. When he arrived home, the house was quiet. Sarah wouldn't be back for hours, and that gave him the time he needed to begin. First, he went to his computer and started researching. He knew enough about technology to understand that he needed surveillance. Cameras, discreetly placed around the house, would give him the evidence he needed. Sarah was arrogant enough to think she could continue her affair under his roof without him knowing. He would turn that arrogance against her. Within an hour, James had ordered several high-quality cameras. They were small, easy to conceal, and could be accessed remotely. He smiled grimly as he finalized the purchase. In a few days, he would begin gathering the proof that would destroy both Sarah and Martin. But cameras were just the beginning. James knew that if he wanted to win this game, he needed legal backing. His mind went to David, his lawyer and longtime friend. David had handled several of his business matters in the past, but now James needed his expertise for something far more personal. He picked up the phone and called David. It was late, but David answered on the second ring, sensing the urgency in James's voice. "James? Everything all right?" "Not really," James said, his tone flat. "I need your help. It's personal." There was a pause on the other end, then David spoke again, his voice more serious now. "What's going on? If you think the story is good, leave a comment with the number 1, and if not, please subscribe to the channel. If the video is helpful to you, don't forget to hit the like button." "Sarah's been cheating on me," James said bluntly. He wasn't in the mood to sugarcoat anything. "With Martin." David let out a low whistle. That's rough, James. I'm sorry. What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me prepare for a divorce. I want everything in place before I confront her. I'm going to get proof of the affair, and when I have it, I want to make sure she gets nothing. Not the house, not the money, nothing." David was silent for a moment, processing. "All right," he said finally. "We'll need to be smart about this. You're going to need clear evidence, and we'll want to document everything. It might take time, but if we do this right, you'll have the upper hand." "That's what I want," James said. "I'm also going to need anything you can find on Martin. I want to hit him where it hurts. David hesitated. James, I understand the need for revenge, but you need to be careful here. We can't do anything illegal. Don't worry, James replied. I'm not planning anything reckless. But Martin's not exactly a saint. I've heard rumors about him skimming off company funds. If I can get proof of that, I'll use it against him. David sighed. All right, but be careful. I'll start looking into it. And James, I'm sorry this is happening to you. Let me know if you need anything else. Thanks, David, James said, his voice tight. I'll be in touch. After hanging up, James felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't helpless. He had control. And that was what he needed right now, control over a situation that had made him feel powerless. Over the next few days, James kept up the facade of normalcy. He didn't confront Sarah. He didn't change his routine. He acted as though everything was fine, even though inside, he was plotting her downfall. The cameras arrived, and James installed them discreetly around the house. He placed them in areas where Sarah wouldn't suspect a thing, the living room, the hallway, even their bedroom. If she brought Martin here, he would know. James also began digging into Martin's background. He made a few discreet calls to people within the company, asking about the financials without raising too many suspicions. It didn't take long for him to find what he was looking for: irregularities in the books, small discrepancies that had gone unnoticed by most, but not by James. Martin had been embezzling funds, just as James had suspected. With every piece of information he gathered, James felt more in control. He was building a case, not just against Sarah, but against Martin too. When the time came, he would confront them both, and neither of them would see it coming. James's decision had been made. He would destroy them, and he would do it methodically, just as he had planned. There was no turning back now. In the days that followed, James threw himself into his plan with cold precision. Every smile, every casual conversation he shared with Sarah was now a facade. She had no idea that behind his composed exterior, he was documenting every move she made. The cameras he had installed around the house blended seamlessly into their surroundings, hidden in places Sarah wouldn't think to look. The living room, the hallway, even their bedroom, every corner was under surveillance. James watched the footage obsessively. It didn't take long for the proof he needed to start piling up. Sarah's behavior had grown more brazen, as if she didn't even care to hide her affair anymore. She brought Martin into their home, a place that was supposed to be sacred, and they acted as if James didn't exist. The camera in the living room captured it all: her greeting Martin with a kiss, their whispered conversations, their touches. It was more than enough to confirm everything. Each piece of evidence he gathered fueled his determination. James wasn't just angry anymore, he was cold and methodical, driven by the desire to see both Sarah and Martin pay for what they had done. As he watched the footage late into the night, the betrayal he felt began to transform into a dark sense of purpose. This was no longer about just ending his marriage, this was about taking back control of his life and punishing those who had wronged him. But his plan extended beyond just catching Sarah. James knew that taking down Martin would require more than just proof of the affair. He needed something that would ruin him professionally as well. That's where Martin's embezzlement came into play. James had been quietly investigating the company's financials through the contacts he had cultivated over the years. It was a delicate process, he couldn't afford to raise suspicions. But after weeks of digging, he finally found what he had been looking for. Martin had been siphoning money from the company's accounts, moving small amounts into offshore holdings over the course of several years. It wasn't a massive sum, not enough to be noticed by the higher-ups, but it was enough to bury Martin if it came to light. James carefully documented everything he found, creating a trail of evidence that would be impossible to dispute. He made copies of the financial records, storing them in a secure place, and kept meticulous notes of his findings. He didn't rush, this had to be done perfectly. When the time came to confront Martin, James wanted to make sure that there was no way out for him. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her charade, oblivious to the fact that James was watching her every move. She still came home late, still made excuses about work, but now James knew exactly where she was going and who she was with. The footage showed her meeting Martin on several occasions, each time growing more reckless, more confident in the belief that James was none the wiser. The hardest part for James was maintaining his composure. Every time he looked at Sarah, he had to suppress the rage that boiled just beneath the surface. There were moments when he wanted to confront her right then and there, to throw the evidence in her face and demand answers. But he held back. He needed to stay focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about catching Sarah in the act, it was about dismantling everything she and Martin thought they had. James's lawyer, David, had been a constant presence during this time, advising him on how to proceed. David stressed the importance of patience, reminding James that they needed to build an airtight case if they wanted to ensure a clean divorce that would leave Sarah with nothing. With the surveillance footage and the financial records, they were well on their way. One evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, James sat alone in the living room, reviewing the latest footage. His eyes scanned the screen as he watched Sarah and Martin embrace once again, this time in the hallway just outside their bedroom. It was a strange feeling, seeing the evidence laid out so clearly in front of him. There was no more room for doubt or denial, this was real, and soon, it would all come crashing down on them. As he watched, a sense of calm washed over him. The plan was working. Soon, Sarah and Martin would pay for everything they had done. James had no illusions that this would bring him peace or closure, but it would bring justice. And for now, that was enough. James saved the footage, cataloging it with the rest of the evidence he had gathered. His next move would be crucial, and it had to be timed perfectly. He wouldn't confront Sarah until everything was in place. But when he did, it would be on his terms, with no room for escape. The days passed in a blur as James continued to gather more proof. Each new piece of evidence brought him closer to the moment he had been waiting for. He was patient, methodical, and above all, determined. There was no turning back now. As he prepared for the inevitable confrontation, James felt something shift inside him. The man who had once been consumed by grief and anger was gone. In his place was someone colder, someone who saw this betrayal not as a personal failure, but as a puzzle to be solved, a game to be won. And James was winning. James had been waiting for the perfect moment to confront Martin. It had to be somewhere public enough that Martin wouldn't make a scene, but private enough for James to control the conversation. He arranged a lunch meeting under the guise of discussing business matters, something Martin would easily fall for. Martin's arrogance would prevent him from seeing what was truly coming. They met at a small, upscale restaurant just outside of the city, a place frequented by executives looking for quiet lunches away from the hustle and bustle. James arrived early, choosing a table in the back where they wouldn't be disturbed. He wanted privacy, but not isolation. When Martin arrived, he greeted James with his usual smug smile, clearly expecting a conversation about the latest office developments or perhaps another opportunity to gloat about his successes. He had no idea what was in store for him. "James," Martin said as he sat down, "nice of you to invite me out. What's on your mind?" James returned the smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, a few things. Thought it was time we caught up." Martin ordered a drink and leaned back in his chair, completely unaware of the shift in James's demeanor. He still saw James as the quiet, compliant employee who never rocked the boat. That was exactly what James had counted on. As they exchanged pleasantries, James waited for the right moment. His heart was steady, his mind clear. The time for revenge had come, and he was ready. After a few minutes of small talk, he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a level only Martin could hear. "I know about you and Sarah," James said, his tone calm but firm. The change in Martin's expression was subtle, but James saw it. The slight twitch in his jaw, the brief widening of his eyes before he composed himself. For a moment, Martin looked like he was going to deny it, but then the smirk returned. "Well, I suppose you've finally figured it out," Martin said, his tone dismissive. It was bound to happen eventually. James didn't react to the taunt. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on Martin, his next words hitting like a hammer. I also know about the embezzlement. The money you've been siphoning off over the years. Offshore accounts, creative accounting. It's all very interesting. This time, Martin couldn't hide his shock. His smirk faltered, and his eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held just moments before. Oh, I think you do, James replied, his voice still calm. I have all the proof I need. The numbers, the transactions, everything. And I'm prepared to go to the authorities unless you do exactly as I say. Martin's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, James saw genuine fear in his boss's eyes, and it gave him a dark sense of satisfaction. What do you want? Martin finally asked, his voice low, defeated. It's simple, James said, leaning back in his chair. You're going to resign from the company. Quietly. No scandal, no fuss. You'll cite personal reasons, health, whatever you want. But you'll be gone by the end of the week. Martin stared at him, disbelief and panic warring on his face. And if I don't? James's smile was cold. Then I expose everything. The affair, the embezzlement. You'll lose your career, your reputation, and you'll likely face jail time. I'm sure your friends at the company won't appreciate the hit to their stock prices, either. You'll be ruined, Martin. The silence between them was thick with tension. Martin's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his drink, taking a long gulp as he tried to steady himself. He knew James had him cornered. There was no way out. After what felt like an eternity, Martin finally nodded. Fine, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll resign. But this stays between us. James raised an eyebrow. That depends on you. As long as you're out of my life, I have no reason to drag this out any further. Martin nodded again, looking utterly defeated. The man who had always held power over James now sat across from him, broken and humiliated. James had won, and the realization gave him a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The rest of the lunch was conducted in near silence. Martin ate little, his appetite clearly gone, while James calmly finished his meal. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he realized the first part of his plan had succeeded. Martin was finished. As they parted ways outside the restaurant, Martin didn't even look James in the eye. He muttered something about getting his affairs in order and left without so much as a handshake. James watched him go, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. The confrontation had gone exactly as planned. Martin was out of his life, and soon, Sarah would be as well. James knew there was still more to do, more steps to take before he could truly close this chapter, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet victory. Back at home, James sat in the living room, quietly reflecting on the confrontation with Martin. The house was quiet, the air heavy with tension that had yet to surface. He had always known this moment would come, when Sarah would sense that something was wrong, that he knew everything. It wasn't a question of if, but when. And now, he was prepared. It wasn't long before Sarah returned home. The sound of the door opening and closing echoed through the house, followed by the familiar clatter of her heels on the hardwood floor. James didn't move from his spot, he waited. He knew that she would come to him, and when she did, it would all unravel. James? Sarah's voice called out from the hallway. There was an edge to it, a tension that had been building between them for weeks. In here, James replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. Sarah entered the living room, her expression guarded, but James could see the worry behind her eyes. She knew something was off. She had probably felt it for days, maybe even weeks, but now it was undeniable. She stood there for a moment, as if unsure of how to start the conversation, before finally taking a seat across from him. What's going on? She asked, her tone cautious. You've been different lately. James met her gaze, his face unreadable. For a moment, he simply stared at her, letting the silence stretch between them. Then, with a calmness that surprised even him, he spoke. "I know about you and Martin," he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. Sarah's reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, and she stiffened in her seat, her face draining of color. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it, but the words didn't come. Instead, she stared at him, her expression a mixture of shock and fear. What are you talking about?" she finally managed to say, her voice shaky. James didn't blink. "Don't bother lying, Sarah. I know everything. The affair, the lies, all of it." Sarah's mouth opened and closed again, her mind clearly scrambling to find a way out of this. But there was none. James had made sure of that. "I have proof," he continued, his voice unwavering. "I've been watching. I know about the nights you've spent with him, the meetings, everything. I've seen the footage." The color drained even further from Sarah's face, her hands trembling as she reached up to cover her mouth. "Footage," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I installed cameras around the house," James explained, his tone still eerily calm. "I have everything I need. There's no use denying it." Sarah sat there, frozen, her eyes wide with horror. For a moment, it seemed like she couldn't process what was happening, like the reality of the situation was too much for her to comprehend. But then, slowly, she began to crumble. Her face contorted with a mixture of fear and regret, and she shook her head as if trying to push the truth away. "James, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. It wasn't supposed to." James raised a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," he said sharply. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You've been lying to me for months. You betrayed me." Tears began to well in Sarah's eyes, and she reached out toward him, as if trying to bridge the distance between them. "Please, James, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. I made a mistake." James stared at her, unmoved. "A mistake? This wasn't a mistake, Sarah. This was a choice. You chose to betray me. You chose to sleep with him. And you kept choosing it every time you lied to my face." Sarah's tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as sobs racked her body. "I'm sorry," she whispered through her tears. "I'm so sorry, James. Please don't do this." But James wasn't swayed. He had prepared for this moment, for her breakdown, for the tears and the pleas for forgiveness. He had already made his decision, and there was no going back. "I'm filing for divorce," he said coldly. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. You'll get nothing. Not the house, not the money, nothing." Sarah's sobs grew louder, her body trembling as the full weight of his words hit her. "No, please, James, don't do this. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, we can." "There's nothing to fix," James interrupted, his voice hard. "You've destroyed everything. Our marriage, our life, it's all over. I don't want you here anymore." Sarah looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please. I love you, James. I made a mistake, but I love you. Don't leave me." James shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "You don't love me, Sarah. If you did, you wouldn't have done this." He stood up, his decision final. "Pack your things. I want you out of this house by tomorrow." Sarah collapsed into sobs again, her body shaking uncontrollably, but James didn't stay to watch. He walked out of the room, leaving her to her breakdown, the sound of her crying echoing in his ears as he made his way upstairs. The marriage was over. There was no turning back now. After Sarah had left the house, taking only a few belongings with her, James felt a strange sense of calm. The storm that had been brewing in his life was beginning to settle. Martin had been dealt with, Sarah was gone, and the divorce proceedings were underway. James had meticulously built the case, and everything was falling into place exactly as he had planned. But it wasn't over yet. A few days after Sarah's departure, James received a call from an unknown number. He considered ignoring it, but something made him pick it up. On the other end of the line was a voice that immediately set him on edge. It was deep, gruff, and had an air of menace that James couldn't shake. "James Mercer," the voice said, slow and deliberate. "I hear you've been causing some problems for my girl." James's grip on the phone tightened. He didn't recognize the voice, but he understood immediately who it was. "Who is this?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. "The name's Victor," the man replied. "I think you know who I am." Victor. The man Sarah had been seeing before Martin. She hadn't mentioned him directly, but through his investigation, James had learned about the other men she had been involved with. Victor was the one with the violent reputation, the one who had given James pause when he first uncovered Sarah's infidelity. While Martin was smug and arrogant, Victor was something else entirely, a man who didn't take kindly to being crossed. James remained silent, his mind racing as Victor continued speaking. "I've got a problem, James," Victor said. "See, Sarah's been telling me all about what you've been up to. Kicking her out, threatening her, ruining her life. That's not going to fly with me. You need to back off." James's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew Victor was trying to intimidate him, to provoke a reaction, but James wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. "This has nothing to do with you," James said, his voice steady. "Sarah and I are getting divorced. She's out of my life now, and that's where it ends." Victor let out a low, humorless chuckle. "That's where you're wrong, my friend. See, I don't like the way you've been treating Sarah. She's under my protection now, and if you think you can just throw her out like garbage and move on with your life, you've got another thing coming." James's anger flared, but he kept his emotions in check. "This is between Sarah and me. Stay out of it." "I don't think you understand," Victor said, his tone growing colder. "This isn't a request. You leave her alone, or you're going to have a very serious problem on your hands. And trust me, you don't want to see what happens when I have to handle things personally." The threat hung in the air, thick with menace. James had heard about Victor's violent past, rumors of fights, broken bones, and worse. But he wasn't about to back down, not after everything he had been through. "I'm not afraid of you," James said, his voice low and controlled. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Victor spoke again, his voice dripping with malice. "You should be." The line went dead, leaving James standing in the middle of his kitchen, the phone still pressed to his ear. For a long moment, he didn't move. The weight of Victor's threat lingered in the air, a reminder that while Sarah and Martin might be out of his life, the consequences of their actions weren't over. James set the phone down, his mind working through the situation. Victor was dangerous, that much was clear. And if he had involved himself in Sarah's affairs, it meant that this wasn't going to end with a simple divorce. Victor would want retribution, and James knew enough about him to take the threat seriously. But he wasn't going to let Victor scare him. He had come too far, endured too much to let some thug dictate how his life would unfold. James wasn't a man who backed down, not anymore. He began to think through his options. The cameras were still installed in the house, capturing everything that went on. He would keep them running in case Victor tried something. And if it came to it, he wasn't above defending himself. He had never been a violent man, but he wasn't naive either. If Victor posed a physical threat, James would be ready. Later that evening, James sat in the living room, replaying the conversation in his head. Victor had sounded confident, almost certain that James would fold under the pressure. But Victor didn't know him, didn't understand that James was no longer the passive man who had let life happen to him. He was different now, colder, more calculating. As the night wore on, James felt a creeping sense of anticipation. Victor would come, of that he was sure. And when he did, James would be ready. In the days that followed, James lived with the weight of Victor's threat hanging over him. He went about his routine, went to work, came home, all the while waiting for the moment when Victor would make his move. The tension built slowly, an undercurrent of danger that lurked beneath the surface of his every thought. And then, one night, it happened. A loud crash echoed through the house, jolting James awake. He sprang out of bed, his heart pounding as he moved toward the sound. His mind raced. Victor had come, just as he'd expected. The confrontation he had been preparing for was finally here. The crash reverberated through the house, shaking James from the uneasy sleep he'd finally managed to drift into. His heart pounded in his chest as he sprang out of bed, grabbing the gun he had stashed in his nightstand drawer. The weight of it in his hand felt heavier than he expected, but there was no time for second-guessing. Victor had come, just as he had anticipated. James moved quietly down the hallway, his senses on high alert. His mind raced through everything that had led up to this moment, the betrayal, the affair, Martin's downfall, Sarah's breakdown, and now, this final confrontation. It had all been leading to this, and James knew he couldn't afford to falter. As he approached the living room, he could hear the faint sounds of footsteps and the rustling of furniture. Victor was inside, and from the sound of it, he wasn't trying to be subtle. James took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the gun as he rounded the corner. There, standing in the middle of the room, was Victor. He was bigger than James had expected, his frame hulking in the dim light of the living room. His face was twisted into a sneer, a mixture of anger and amusement. He was holding a crowbar, casually swinging it at his side as if daring James to make a move. "I told you this would happen," Victor said, his voice low and menacing. "You should have listened when I warned you." James kept his eyes locked on Victor, his gun raised but not yet aimed. His mind was racing, weighing his options. He didn't want this to end in violence, but it was clear that Victor had no intention of backing down. This wasn't a man who could be reasoned with. "Get out of my house, Victor," James said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Victor laughed, a deep, mocking sound. "Or what? You're going to shoot me? I don't think you've got it in you, Mercer." James didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, his gun now aimed directly at Victor's chest. The sight of the weapon made Victor pause, but only for a moment. His sneer returned, and he took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You think a little gun's going to stop me?" Victor taunted. "I've dealt with worse than you, Mercer. You're just a pathetic man who couldn't even keep his wife." The words hit James like a punch to the gut, but he didn't flinch. He had been through too much to let Victor's taunts get under his skin. This was about more than pride or anger now, this was about survival. "Last chance," James said, his voice cold. "Leave, or I will shoot." For a moment, there was silence. Victor's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker. He raised the crowbar, his muscles tensing as if preparing to strike. "Do it," Victor growled, taking another step forward. "Let's see if you've got the guts." James didn't wait any longer. He pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house, deafening in the stillness of the night. Victor staggered backward, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had hit him. His face twisted in pain, but it wasn't enough to stop him. With a roar of fury, he lunged at James, swinging the crowbar with all his strength. James barely had time to react, diving to the side as the crowbar crashed into the wall where he had just been standing. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as he raised the gun again. Victor was bleeding, but he was still coming, his eyes wild with rage. They circled each other, the tension thick in the air. James could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his every sense heightened as he watched Victor's every move. He knew he couldn't afford to miss again. Victor charged, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc. James ducked just in time, the metal whistling past his head. He fired again, this time hitting Victor in the leg. The big man let out a howl of pain, stumbling as his leg buckled beneath him. But even then, Victor didn't stop. He dropped the crowbar, reaching out with both hands as he lunged at James, his face contorted with fury. They collided, and for a moment, it felt like James was being crushed under the weight of Victor's bulk. He struggled to push the man off, his mind racing as he fought for control. With a surge of adrenaline, James twisted out of Victor's grasp, rolling to the side as he brought the gun up one final time. He didn't hesitate. He fired again, the shot hitting Victor square in the chest. Victor let out a choked gasp, his eyes wide with shock as he stumbled backward. He collapsed onto the floor, his body convulsing once before going still. James stood there, panting, the gun still clutched in his trembling hand. The house was eerily silent now, the only sound the ringing in his ears from the gunshots. He stared down at Victor's lifeless body, a mixture of disbelief and relief washing over him. It was over. The man who had threatened his life, who had promised to destroy him, was gone. James had won. But as he stood there, the weight of what he had just done began to sink in. He had taken a life. He had killed a man. The victory felt hollow, empty. James lowered the gun, his body shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. He stumbled back, collapsing onto the couch as the reality of the situation hit him. He had survived, but at what cost? The police would come, questions would be asked, and there would be consequences. But for now, in this moment, James was alive. He had faced the threat, and he had emerged victorious. But the price of that victory would haunt him for the rest of his life. The following morning, the house was eerily quiet, as if the violence that had unfolded the night before had never happened. But the signs were there, the bullet holes in the walls, the shattered furniture, and, most telling of all, the lifeless body of Victor lying in the living room. James sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands, trying to steady his breathing. He had barely slept, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He had called the police immediately after Victor's death, explaining the situation in a voice that sounded distant and hollow even to his own ears. It had been a matter of self-defense, a fact that was clear from the evidence, but James knew that the emotional aftermath would be far more complicated than any legal resolution. He had killed a man, and that wasn't something he could easily shake off. The police arrived soon after the call, the flashing lights of their cars casting an eerie glow through the windows. James had expected this, he knew the procedure. They would take his statement, collect the evidence, and eventually, he would have to answer for what he had done. But in the end, it would be ruled as self-defense, just as he had hoped. The officers moved through the house with practiced efficiency, photographing the scene and asking him questions in measured tones. James answered them all, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He had nothing left to give. As the morning wore on, the reality of the situation slowly began to sink in. Victor was dead. The man who had threatened his life, who had tried to intimidate him into submission, was gone. The danger was over. James should have felt relieved, triumphant even. But instead, he felt nothing. The victory he had been chasing for so long felt hollow, empty. There was no satisfaction, no closure, only a deep, aching sense of loss. Once the police had finished their investigation, they took Victor's body away, leaving James alone in the house. The silence was deafening. He wandered through the wreckage of the living room, his eyes glazing over as he surveyed the damage. This had been his home, a place of safety and comfort, and now it felt like a battlefield. The bullet holes in the walls, the broken furniture, the bloodstains on the floor, they were all reminders of the violence that had erupted here. And no matter how hard he tried, James couldn't escape the reality of what had happened. He slumped back down onto the couch, his mind racing. What had he truly accomplished? Martin had been taken down, Sarah was gone, and Victor was dead. He had won, hadn't he? But as he sat there, staring at the ruined living room, James couldn't help but feel that something vital had been lost along the way. The man he had once been, the man who believed in loyalty, in love, in trust, was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. James thought back to the beginning of it all, when his suspicions about Sarah's affair had first started to grow. Back then, he had been hurt, angry, betrayed. But now, after everything that had happened, those emotions felt distant, almost foreign. He wasn't sure what he felt anymore. The betrayal that had once consumed him now seemed insignificant compared to the emptiness that had taken its place. He had spent months planning his revenge, meticulously gathering evidence, preparing for this moment. But now that it was over, now that the final piece of his plan had fallen into place, he realized that the revenge he had so desperately sought had cost him more than he had ever anticipated. It had cost him his peace, his sense of self, and, in a way, his humanity. The door creaked open, and James looked up to see David, his lawyer and friend, standing in the doorway. David had come as soon as he had heard the news, and now he stood there, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. "Jesus, James," David muttered, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "What the hell happened here?" James didn't answer at first. He just stared at the floor, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's over. Victor's dead. It's all over." David sat down next to him, letting out a heavy sigh. "I heard. The cops told me it was self-defense, but I know this isn't how you wanted it to end." James shook his head slowly, his hands trembling in his lap. "I didn't want any of this, David. I thought I would feel something. Satisfaction, relief, closure. But I don't. I just feel empty." David nodded, his expression softening. "It's always like that, James. Revenge never fills the hole. It just leaves you with more questions." James leaned back against the couch, closing his eyes. "I don't even know who I am anymore." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung in the air between them, heavy and oppressive. David eventually stood up, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "You're going to get through this, James. It's going to take time, but you'll find your way back. You've just got to take it one step at a time." James opened his eyes, looking up at David with a tired, hollow expression. He wanted to believe his friend, wanted to believe that there was a way back from this. But deep down, he wasn't sure if that was true. As David left, closing the door behind him, James remained on the couch, staring into the distance. The house was quiet again, the chaos of the last few days finally over. But the emptiness remained, and James knew that it would be a long time before he felt whole again, if he ever did. If you think the story is good, leave a comment with the number 1, and if not, please subscribe to the channel. If the video is helpful to you, don't forget to hit the like button.